Sri Lanka's President Kumara Dissanayake is on his visit to India, the first foreign visit that he's undertaken since being elected president of Sri Lanka. It's an important visit, particularly coming on the back of the fact that it's been a troubled time for India in its neighborhood, but an interesting visit by the Sri Lankan president coming from a complicated legacy, a party with a complicated legacy when it comes to India, but coming to India, striking a pragmatic tone was Kumara Dissanayake, also known popularly in Sri Lanka as AKD. But what exactly was the significance of his visit? What exactly was achieved? What exactly can we take away from about the India-Sri Lanka relationship? Joining us to decode some of this is Aditya Shivamurthy of the Observer Research Foundation, one of India's youngest and most talented scholars when it comes to covering the South Asian region. Aditya, thank you so much for joining us. Could you tell me a little bit about the visit? President Dissanayake met Prime Minister Modi yesterday, struck a fairly pragmatic tone when it came to India-Sri Lanka relations. Could you tell us a little bit about what jumped out to you about this visit? What are the key takeaways?
Shashank, first of all, thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure, talking to you and discussing my ideas. Look, for me, for the starters, I think I would rather call this visit as an icebreaker visit, right? For the very reason that the visit in itself is more of keeping in traditions with what former Sri Lankan presidents have done. They've all visited India as their first destination of visit. So Anura Dissanayake has not deviated from that trend, but he's rather followed that custom, that tradition of Sri Lankan presidents visiting India. The second most interesting thing is, if you notice, there were less of memorandums of understandings or any agreements signed within the visit itself. And that shows, the visit was mostly to discuss where we go ahead from here. This was an icebreaker because we all know JVP had a past which was not necessarily in favor of India. They had their anti-India leanings, and they also had certain reservations about the Tamil rights, about the 13th Amendment. So all of these things, there are a lot of bilateral irritants and a lot of history that has to be, assessed in the current time and contemporary times. And I think that is where the current visit takes a lot of highlight, and it's one of the I would say it's one of the biggest wins for India's foreign policy neighborhood. Imagining that someone like AKD and some party like JVP, which was so anti-Indian in its past, is now as pragmatic, and India has been able to tap on that momentum. So I think this would rather be an icebreaker kind of a session where both the parties understand each other, understand what are their differences, what are the convergences, and how do we take the next 5 years from here onwards.
Aditya, could I ask you for a bit of a potted history? Let's just start with that, of the JVP. I know you've been on our channel explaining this in the past. Could you explain a little bit about JVP, and which is, of course, Kumara Dissanayaka's party? Could you explain something about its troubled history with India?
See, JVP recognizes itself as earlier days, it used to take pride in recognizing itself as a Marxist and a Sinhala party, right? It was an outfit that rose against India, and that was quite Marxist in its nature. And one of the core teachings of JVP in the mid 60s, in the mid 1960s, was also the fact that they were anti-Indian. They continued to criticize India for Indian expansionism and impeding on Sri Lanka's sovereignty. So this was something that they carried on with their ideological legacy. In 1971, they led their first insurgency against the state. And this was also quickly put down with India's assistance, not majorly, but in a reasonable way. India was helping Sri Lanka in securing the sea, securing airspace, etc., etc. So that is where the first conflict of that sort took place. Now, in 1989, when India and Sri Lanka signed the accord, in 1987, and when Indian troops were deployed in Sri Lanka, that is when the JVP rose into its second phase of insurgency, where they criticized India again for impeding on Sri Lanka's sovereignty, and they said that 13th Amendment is something of an imposition from an external power, and that would not be implemented. So they rose up against Sri Lanka, and they continued to have an insurgency in the southern part of Sri Lanka. Ultimately, they continued to be very anti-India in their tilt and in their ideological outlook. But in 1989, in the 90s, the insurgency was put down, and slowly they joined into mainstream politics. But till the end of the war, they continued to, push against any kind of federal rights or any kind of autonomy that the Tamil provinces and politicians were asking for. It was only in late 2010s they formed this broader coalition of leftist parties they called themselves as NPP. Anura Dissanayake became the leader, and they rebranded themselves as somewhat of a moderate left party. Or a moderate left alliance. And today, what we see in its contemporary form is JVP, mellowed down in its anti-India rhetoric, mellowed down in its Marxist rhetoric, but also somewhat showing to be a nationalist party, but also a party that tries to bring in reforms and is a non-elitist party.
So, of course, now some of the context is that the JVP went from a party that was really considered to be on the fringes of Sri Lankan politics, not very popular, but after the economic crisis in Sri Lanka and just the massive political earthquake in that country over the last couple of years, JVP went from being a party that was very much on the fringes of power to sweeping the parliamentary elections that happened just a little while ago, and of course winning the presidential election with Kumara Dissanayake, who had just been had been a minister before, but of course was not a political insider, as it were, becoming president of Sri Lanka. So of course coming into a great deal of political relevance, and so that's what Aditya is explaining, that of course now over the last because given that contentious history and its relatively recent rise to power, there were questions about the JVP's policies towards India. So, Aditya, could I ask you then, he came to India, the president had that meeting with Prime Minister Narendra Modi, talked about everything from trade to India's role in supporting Sri Lanka in the economic crisis that they had, giving bailouts and so on and so forth. Do you think that he was striking a much more pragmatic tone on India, trying to reassure people in India that he will largely try to continue the trend that the path that India-Sri Lanka ties have been on for the last couple of years?
Yeah, see, Shashank, this is one thing that has grown clear out of the visit, especially with with AKD prioritizing India as his first destination of visit. He's tried to keep in sending the signal that we continue to engage with India. India is our priority partner. We are grateful for India for offering the $4 billion assistance, and we will not engage in any sorts of activities that would impede on India's sovereignty or hamper its security concerns. So I think that kind of signaling has grown more and more clear. But look, let's not forget that there are also new and fresh irritants with the coming of the new government, right? The government has completely come upon its constituency of anti-corruption, anti-elite. It has politicized a lot of projects that have come in, especially with India trying to assist Sri Lanka, in the economic crisis. And then there were a lot of private sector investments that flew in. And obviously, the current government, that is the AKD led JVP, which was back in the power as an opposition, continued to criticize on a lot of these deals. They continued criticizing the Sri Lankan government. They said that these deals are corrupt. They are, continuing to promote bribe and briberies throughout the public system. So that is something they wanted to do away with, right? And he has come to power in this strong mandate of anti-corruption. And that is where, the Adani project in itself is in big trouble, because they have consistently pointed out that we will continue to have an investigation, if possible, do away with the project itself. So currently they have launched an investigation. They have launched a probe against the project. And that is something that is an issue, we should not forget. Now, second issue we should not forget is the 13th Amendment, or the Tamil issue. India continues to push on that. But in fact, with the new majority throughout the country, right? JVP is in itself the first party, the first parliamentary elections where we are seeing Tamils, Christians, Sinhalas, all supporting JVP in itself. They have won a lot of seats in the Tamil provinces. So I think that has ushered in some kind of nationalism and some kind of national mandate for JVP to push back against India's consistent, asking for the 13th Amendment. And I think that is what, the current government is also trying to do. It is trying to explore a solution beyond the 13th Amendment. Now, there is another irritant, obviously, that we speak of is the fishermen issue. Anura Dissanayake has again spoken about the issue. And then, interestingly, the issue of land bridge has not come up in this visit. So these are irritants which exist. Now, that said, there have been discussions, and that's why I said this is an ice-breaking visit, where they have had honest conversations and have explored the possible ways to go beyond it. Because for India also, this is the new regime and the new government they are dealing with. It has never been in power. They will have to be familiar with what kind of ideological and domestic politics they come up with. And for Sri Lanka, I think on one side it has assured that look, we are thankful for the assistance that you have offered, and we will continue to be, sensitive to your concerns. But at the end of the day, there are certain irritants that we also want to bring up to the forefront, and this is something we want to discuss going ahead. So I think this is a win in a way, but it also leaves a lot of spaces that will eventually be covered and discussed in the future.
Aditya, let's discuss this issue by issue. I think one thing that came up and was covered with a great deal of interest in India was Kumara Dissanayaka's commitment that Sri Lanka's territory will not be used in a way that is detrimental to India's security. This is, of course, a lot of people took that as something of a reference, or at least the background to this was Chinese research vessels coming to the Indian Ocean over the last couple of years. India, of course, they've been called spy ships. And the idea was that they were undertaking sensitive hydrographical research that would be useful to the Chinese military. These vessels were then docking in Sri Lankan ports as well as in the Maldives. There was some sort of compromise reached with the previous government in Sri Lanka. But the question again in India was, how will this new government react to India's security concerns when it comes to these Chinese research vessels? Did you see this? So how did you see this commitment by the Dissanayake that Sri Lanka's territory will not be used in a way that cuts against India's security interests?
See, I think it's quite an optimistic statement to make. But let's not forget that every neighbor or neighboring president has come to India have assured the same thing. We will not let our territory be used against India. This is not something new. I would say this is something that Rajpaksas have assured. Yet they continue to have a good relationship with China. This is something Muizu has assured now, and yet there is some kind of good relationship that exists with China. I think that kind of statements usually come and go, and I think obviously they also understand that for India as a bigger power, it is a prime concern to maintain its sovereignty and also to push back against the security threats. And the smaller countries have understood that, and they've tried to assuage India in certain instances, but in certain instances, the pressure and the structural issues that exist with China, the structural differences that exist with China, ultimately come to play, and they will have to take a step back. Now let's talk about the spy ship issue, right? Under Ranil Wickremesinghe, there was a consistent issue. This was a consistent issue that was coming up within between India and Sri Lanka till the embargo was imposed for an year. And in fact, despite China not being a big time assistance provider during the economic crisis, and India continued to do it, yet Sri Lanka had to bend backwards and let the Chinese ships come in on multiple instances. That is because China has made so much inroads that it is difficult to ignore for any other incoming government or any other party to be in. In fact, let's take an example even from the MDP government by Ibrahim Soli, right? He was staunchly pro-India, but at the end of the day, he had to let some Chinese projects come in and not to upset them or not to antagonize them completely. And this is something that we see throughout the neighborhood. I think the more interesting thing for anyone who has been watching this visit is the fact that India has pledged support in terms of offering hydrography equipments to Sri Lanka, and India and Sri Lanka are also discussing a potential agreement on defense cooperation. Now, what it is exactly, we don't know. But I believe that by promoting Sri Lanka's domestic capacities in terms of surveillance equipment or hydrographic surveys, I think that is one good way to push back against the Chinese. If you make a country strong enough to have its own equipment and deal with its own security concerns, why would they need a third country? And I think this is something that India has understood quite well, and that is where I think that is one of the highlights of this visit. I would not say, look, I mean, at the end of the day, Anura Dissanayake will visit China, right? When it is going to happen, we don't know. But when he visits, obviously the Chinese will continue to pressurize Anura Dissanayake to let Chinese ships be docked in Sri Lanka. And this is an issue that has come up on high level visits as well. The Chinese have been unhappy that Sri Lanka, has imposed a ban on Chinese issues, and this is something that will continue to come up with Anura Dissanayake's government as well. And again, the agreement ends on December 31st. We don't know what is going to happen after that. Sri Lanka says it has its own agreement that is coming up in own mechanism to deal with spy ships that is still in the making. But there is consistent pressure from the Chinese. So let's see how. or in fact, when Anura Dissanayake visits China, how will he deal with this issue? And then we can probably speak more in concretely, if at all they could assure India's security concerns. But look, again, ultimately, it's not to blame Sri Lanka, but the structural differences with China and Chinese ambitions are as such that they will continue to pressure Sri Lanka or any other South Asian country to do something that might not necessarily be comfortable to India.
Let me ask another question about the Tamil issue. There's, of course, the 13th Amendment of the Sri Lankan Constitution, which was put into place with the support of India. India, of course, pushed for an amendment to the Constitution of Sri Lanka, guaranteeing more political rights to the Tamil minority that live in the northern parts of Sri Lanka. This has been a hugely controversial issue between the two countries over the last 30, 40 years. And Dissanayake's party, the JVP, has at times in its history been extremely critical of the 13th Amendment, as well as of India's role in helping push that sort of political compromise into Sri Lanka's politics. Could you tell us a little bit about what the discussion was here? Because in India, that continues to be a relevant issue about how Tamils are treated in Sri Lanka. It has a political resonance in here. You saw the foreign secretary also make some comments talking about how the Sri Lankan side has promised to fully implement this political compromise, the 13th Amendment. Tell us a little bit about the 13th Amendment. Why exactly is it so important? So if I ask for a potted history of that, and will Dissanayake be more open to, given his party's history, to securing more rights and representations for the Tamil minority in Sri Lanka?
See, let's go by question, right? I mean, when you ask about the 13th Amendment, obviously it came with the Indo-Sri Lanka Accord in the late 1980s when the Indian IPKF troops were being deployed in Sri Lanka. For India, the prime concern was increasing Sinhala nationalism, which had, impacts on Tamils and the Tamil minorities, which would have spillover implications for India. That was a known fact, and it's obviously a threat for India, and that is why India came up with this mechanism, saying that if you continue to devolve powers and maintain a federal structure where the Tamil provinces, especially the northern and eastern provinces, will continue to have their so-called semi-autonomy, but still belonging to the sovereign territory of Sri Lanka, still under Sri Lanka's jurisdiction. But at the end of the day, they will have certain rights that ensures that the Sinhalist nationalist agenda does not really come at the cost of Tamil politics. Now, the fact is, look, Sri Lankans, Sinhalese in Sri Lanka have always been skeptical of Tamils having, basically say rights that are special or guaranteed. The fact that they fear that giving them some kind of autonomy will lead to secession at the end of the day and disintegration of Sri Lanka. On the other hand, for Tamils, this has been continuous issue. They continue to say that being a majority, Sinhalas continue to empower Sinhalist governments, which will ultimately continue to cost Tamil and Tamil identity and Tamil politics. So, but at the end of the day, even for the Tamils, it felt like the 13th Amendment was somewhere of a compromise that did not offer what they wanted. And for Sinhalas, it was more of a deal that was imposed by an external power and which had the high potential of disintegration of Sri Lanka. So neither the Sinhalese nor were the Tamils completely happy. But at the end of the day, the Tamils continued to push back against Sri Lanka and the Sinhalist, nationalist parties by using India as a leverage and by using 13th Amendment as a leverage. And that is something that has existed in the past and continues to exist, especially after the post-war years. Now, LTT in itself was also not very happy with the 13th Amendment. In fact, Prabhakaran was very disgruntled and was angry towards India. But this is a story of another day. But at the end of the day, the Tamils themselves were not completely satisfied with the 13th Amendment. So currently what we have in itself is the 13th Amendment, where basically a lot of powers have been given up to the Tamil provinces. That said, the land and police power of these Tamil provinces have still been withheld by the central government, and that is basically stopping the 13th Amendments from its full implementation. On the other hand, the Tamil provinces have continued to ask for the land and the police powers to be dissolved and be given to the Tamil provinces, but the Sinhalese nationalist government have hesitated to do so. Now, political parties have differed on that. In fact, Ranil Wickremesinghe and Sajit Premadasa had assured during the parliamentary elections and the presidential elections that they would look for a 13th Amendment solution, complete implementation of the 13th Amendment, but Anura Dissanayake has made no such statement. In fact, Anura Dissanayake calls for federal elections, which is the provincial elections in Sri Lanka. which is in one way also upholding Sri Lankan Tamil minority rights and also provincial federal rights. But at the end of the day, he has also continued to look for a solution that is beyond the 13th Amendment. Now, for India, 13th Amendment is one way to assure its security concern, but for Sri Lanka or any other incoming government, it is more of a political challenge on how do they balance these constituencies. Look, Anura Dissanayake's voter base has not appeared out of the thin. They are basically voters of SLPP. They are basically voters of SLFP. The hardline Sinhala nationalists also basically belonging from the south. They have moved from Rajpaksas to Anura Dissanayake today because they believe Anura Dissanayake is more of a reformist leader. And obviously, if any movement as such that continues to bring in the 13th Amendment and continues to dissolve power will be domestically impactful to Anura Dissanayake's government. It will have cost for Anura Dissanayake's government and for any Sri Lankan nationalist or central government that is in power. So I think that is the bigger concern for any Sri Lankan president, and this will continue to be a matter of debate. But now, as I said, again, with the majority in the Tamil provinces, Anura Dissanayake has continued to look for a solution beyond the 13th Amendment. Now, how will it be implemented with a lot of negotiations is yet to be seen. But before Anura Dissanayake came to India, he had also met a lot of Tamil leaders trying to address their concerns and understand what their concerns are. So again, there are signals that he's trying to look beyond the 13th Amendment, but how will he manage the domestic constituencies and the external constituencies and India is yet to be seen.
Right. Let me ask you one or two more quick questions. During the visit, something I was struck by personally was just the list of projects that they were talking about and saying that India and Sri Lanka will work on everything from a multi-product petroleum pipeline towards selling more liquefied natural gas from India to Sri Lanka. So, of course, meeting more of Sri Lanka's energy needs, providing boosting trade between the two countries, signing an economic cooperation and trade agreement, more infrastructure projects. So it really seemed like there was this slew of projects that the two sides were considering pushing forward. Now, of course, these projects have a history. They came up over the last couple of years. The government of the previous president, Ranil Wickremesinghe, also pushed those agreements. But in Sri Lanka, there was some controversy, as I remember or I recall, that a lot of these projects were seen as sort of handouts given to India because of the support that India provided financially during the economic crisis over the last couple of years. So there was a little bit of controversy, a little bit of resentment hanging over those projects. But Dissanayake has come here. The joint statement of the two countries really, backs a lot of these projects, including their multi-product petroleum pipeline. The UAE has been brought in that project as well. So the big question is, but you also mentioned one project, Aditya, that was this land bridge between India and Sri Lanka that was particularly controversial, that was not mentioned by the two sides. Could I ask you a little bit about this massive slew of connectivity projects that were unveiled a couple of years ago? Do you think most of them are safe and that therefore that the endorsement that they've gotten during this visit largely means that Dissanayake wants to continue on that path with closer integration with India?
See, one thing I would say is in neighborhood, nothing is safe, right? I mean, the way that things get politicized at the end of the day will have bigger implications on any kind of projects being implemented. Look, as far as your question is concerned, look, in Sri Lanka, at least in the elites, there is a bigger, broader consensus that if Sri Lanka has to recover, it will be through connectivity to India. India is their way out to integrate. India is their way out to integrate with the world. India is their way out of their economic crisis, and India is their way out to improve their capacity and their economy, and also make itself into a more resilient country to external shocks. That is a non-partisan consensus. But that said, there are concerns. There are a lot of people who continue to express some kind of skepticism that these projects have basically come with India's assistance, and this is seen some kind of arm twisting tactic by India. But at the end of the day, the political elites of the country feel that one way to recover the economy and the future of Sri Lanka is interlinked with future of India. And Anura Dissanayake is no different. He has gone with the similar kind of projects that basically Ranil Wickremesinghe has discussed. And despite their ideological differences, it is quite impressive. I would say that they have gone ahead with a lot of projects that were discussed in the past that have continued to be there. Now, obviously, certain projects, look, again, as I mentioned, the Adani project, it's been under controversy for a while Right. So basically, the power project has been in controversy for a while, right? Considering how the Anura Dissanayake government has been saying that this is made up of, basically this was in collaboration with old Sri Lankan elites who are corrupt, and there are, bribery issues involved. But anyway, so the fact is that the certain projects like these are being politicized. And look, Anura Dissanayake has come up with a strong mandate, especially because people believe that he will work against corruption. So there is a high possibility that projects in the future will be politicized, calling them corrupt or calling that some deals have fallen flat. So there is a vulnerability. I wouldn't say that all projects are safe. There is a high possibility that Anurag Dissanayake will politicize certain projects, either for domestic politics or for obvious economic concerns or corrupt concerns. That is something that we are yet to see. But there are also in the past he had also said that there would be certain projects that will be under review in the future as well. So we are yet to see where that will go. But at least for now, what we have seen is that there has been push for connectivity, but there is still a possibility that certain projects might be politicized. Now, as far as the other Adani project is concerned, that is the port project. I think the deal has fallen flat, especially with the US imposing, basically US accusing Adani of corruption. So the Adanis have decided that they will go on to the project by themselves. They will invest 500 million by themselves. Um, but that also is a big concern because the project has been slow to pick up its pace, and that is where the JVP. I think recently a minister also made a statement saying that Adani will have to pace up his project, and that is something that we are yet to see. But there is some consistency. There is some support for the port city project, but not necessarily in terms of other projects of Adani that are going on around.
Understood. Aditya, let me ask you two final questions. One question, of course, is on the broader Indian neighborhood, which you also cover very closely. We've had a difficult situation or a difficult time in some of our relationships in the neighborhood, particularly with Bangladesh in the last couple of years. Would we be forgiven for thinking that India turning around the JVP and really seeking to put its the past behind it with this party, which has had a very difficult relationship with, and Dissanayaka's rather successful visit to India? Is this one of the much more successful breakthroughs of Indian foreign policy over the last couple of years?
See, Shashank, I would say India's foreign policy has become quite pragmatic when it comes to neighborhood in the last, say, decade, right? With a neighborhood first policy. Although, I mean, there were certain mistakes, and certain mistakes have been rectified with the Nepal blockade, etc., etc. But what we are seeing today is Indian government is more pragmatic and more willing to engage with a lot of other people and other parties who are not necessarily pro-India in the past or who were pro-China in the past. So I think that kind of pragmatic engagement is what is defining India's foreign policy today. And in that regard, let's say Muizu, right? Muizu had been one of those people for the first year. He continued to have an anti-India stance, rather saying we want to diversify from India, we want to move towards China. But today we have seen India patiently engage with Muizu. We have seen now India slowly starting to engage with Sheikh Hasina, with post Sheikh Hasina's realities in Bangladesh, and we are also seeing the JVP and India trying to basically come up with a new equilibrium. And I think this is a good turn. I think if you pull out this one example of JVP, I think this also shows how pragmatic India's foreign policy has become in a decade. And in that regard, to answer your question, I think yes, this is a big win. Big win that is just begun. We are yet to see a lot in the future, and we are yet to see how the next 5 years will navigate. But I think this is a good start of where things will begin and how things will unfold in the next 5 years.
Last question, Aditya, about China. Over the last couple of years, the sense was that after the Rajapaksa government fell in the aftermath of the massive political upsurge that we saw given the start of the economic crisis in Sri Lanka, the sense was that China's leverage and its influence in Sri Lanka had diminished somewhat. How are you seeing China's influence now that Dissanayaka's government has come in? I think we've already just today, I think, seen an announcement that he will actually be also headed to China very soon. So how do you see China's influence in Sri Lanka? Will they make a bid for renewed influence? Will the Dissanayaka government be open to it, given the fact that China is actually a major creditor when it comes to Sri Lanka, and Sri Lanka needs that economic support? Where do you think that Sri Lanka-China relationship is going to go?
See, I would say, Shashank, keeping realities on its, keeping pragmatic realities on consideration, the ball is actually in China's court. Look, why I say this is because when the economic crisis presented itself in Sri Lanka, India was first to assist, but there was no one to say that China does not have to interfere or China does not have to step in its assistance. China had taken a passive approach then. China has still continued to take a passive approach even today. A lot of projects, a lot of loans, they have basically made no progress. In fact, I mean, this is a bigger question to ask. Why is China not doing it? That's a different debate. Probably it's because of its domestic economic constraints. Probably because the China-Pakistan economic corridor or the China-Myanmar economic corridor not picking up their paces. There are a lot of explanations to this, but or probably because Sri Lankan or the Maldivian government or any other South Asian government is exercising more agency than what they did in the last 4 5 years. There are a lot of explanations, but the fact is that China has itself taken a very passive approach in Sri Lanka. The only investment that we have seen from China come in the last 3 4 years is in Sri Lanka is the oil refinery project, where it has come up with a $4.5 billion investment, which is a private sector investment. Again, not any kind of loan or any kind of assistance that has been offered to Sri Lanka. Today, what we are seeing, in fact, with Dissanayake's visit to India, India and Sri Lanka have made a statement saying that they would go with more of an investment-led growth rather than a loan-led growth, which is basically trying to have a snap at China, saying that we will continue to foster economic cooperation based on private sector investment. So that also presents an opportunity for China. Now, how it wants to go ahead with it is the bigger question. But what we are seeing today is China has mellowed down on its investments. China has mellowed down on its assistance. That said, its influence has not faded. Everyone knows that China is still the world's second largest economy. Everyone knows that China is, a big power which cannot be ignored. So, in fact, Anura Dissanayake will visit China. He will continue to have these negotiations with China and see how to go ahead from here. In fact, let's not forget that China is one of the biggest creditor to Sri Lanka in terms of bilateral, loans. That way, China's influence is not gone. It has just taken a pause. Now, which direction it is heading, which direction it will not head, is something that we'll have to see in the coming years. But I would say for Sri Lanka, it is, at the end of the day, it is inevitable that it will deal with China. It is inevitable that it will invite China to invest more because Sri Lanka needs money. Sri Lanka needs economic recovery. And let's be honest, in today's South Asia, where everyone talks about Indo-Pacific and South Asia, which has become part and parcel of Indo-Pacific, no one wants to put their eggs in one basket, which is India. Everyone wants to diversify their foreign policy. And I'm pretty much sure Sri Lanka is also on the same bet. And that is why you see him going to China, trying to have a conversation with them, understand what they need and what AKD needs and what their government could, how their government could collaborate and cooperate with each other. Again, that said, the ball is still in China's court. If they want to invest, if they want to assist, if they want to have some kind of capacity building programs which have increased in the last 5 6 years, instead of these assistance. So that is something that China has to decide. And let's see how things unfold in the coming years.
Aditya Shivamurthy from the Observer Research Foundation, chronicling for us the history of India-Sri Lanka ties over the last couple of years, as well as the significance of President Dissanayaka's visit to India. Aditya, thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much to our viewers for joining us on India Today Global.